Welcome to Exploring Computing. Today's video is Webpage example, history blog. So in our last example, we saw the use of class in a number of places. We saw that we created a class for captions and a class for photographs and a separate class for right photographs versus left photographs. And this idea of taking divs or other elements we've been giving and providing them with classes can be quite powerful. One of the places that this often shows up is in blogs. So here I've got a blog about Stanford history, and you can see I've done some formatting on it. And in fact, you're going to get a chance to do some formatting on this for your next homework assignment. So we will be providing you with the HTML for this file, but not the CSS. So we do want you to create CSS from scratch. But let's go over the CSS that I used in order to get the current look that we're looking at right here. All right, so if we think about how this blog works, there's a number of different elements on the blog. So there's a bunch of entries in the blog, and each of the entries has a heading with a title, and then there's some dates, and I don't have a footer shown here, but we'll see that in the source there's actually a footer and then a number of tags that you can display for each of the entries on the blog. And so these are all different elements that commonly show up in blogs. Now, if you look at the source of a blog, often you'll see that what they've done is they've taken a number of these items, and some of them might be paragraphs, some of them might be divs, some of them might actually be headings. And they will go ahead and give them classes. So this is what my source code looks like for each of the entries in the blog. And you can see I've given a class for the entries, class for the heading, which has a title and the date in it, a class for the contents, a class for the footers, and a class for the tags that go in the footers. As I mentioned in the end of the caption example, there are some new HTML5 elements that don't actually provide any formatting on their own, but may be used to provide a bit of semantic information. So the example that was relevant for that particular example was there's a figure and a figure caption entry. And so you could replace the class equals entry here with the article HTML5 element. But when I went to look at a number of blogs that are actually on the web, I didn't see any of them using those techniques. Now, it could be that these are just older blogs and that's why they're using the techniques I'm showing you here, or it could be that modern blogging software has not been updated to use those elements. But regardless, the blogs that I looked at look pretty close to what we're seeing here. So we're going to go ahead and continue using this. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is we're going to go through and we're going to take a look at some examples of how I did formatting with this blog. And so again, I think the things to keep in mind are, one, this idea that we have a bunch of divs, and in one case we actually have an H2. If you look carefully, the heading there actually does have an H2 there. We have a bunch of divs and the H2, and we are classifying them by putting a class attribute value pair on them. As I said, this shows up all the time. And then two, as we go through the formatting that I did on each of these, we'll see various different formatting features that I will point out to you that may be useful for your own work. So let's start off with the entry title. And so you can see this is the Leland Stanford purchases land, or the university established, or the earthquake devastates campus. These are my H2s. And you can see that I have the H2, but I've also given it the class entry title. And so I'm going to go ahead and write a rule to apply to the entry titles. I suppose I could also use it for H2s, assuming there aren't other H2s on the web page. You can imagine maybe I have a sidebar that has an H2, or maybe some advertisements that use H2. But I've gone ahead and chosen to use the entry title class selector rather than the H2 selector. You can see I've given a font size, a font weight. I think I mentioned earlier that there are actually font weights can go between 100 and 900. You could also set font weight to bold. I've set a color. And then I think the interesting one for this entry that we haven't talked about is this font family here. Notice I've actually listed 3 font families, Times New Roman, Times, and then Serif. If you list a number of different font families, what will happen is the web browser will look for each of these font families, and as soon as it finds one that matches, it will go ahead and use that. So if there's a font that you're not sure is going to be on the person's computer, you can go ahead and list several fonts, and going from the order of the, hey, I really hope they have this font installed, but if they don't, let's try this font. And if they don't have that one, let's try this font. And then you can end up with either serif or sans serif, which are 2 of the primary choices in terms of design. And we'll talk about those more in the web design lecture. Anyway, the main point I wanted to mention here is just this idea that you can list several fonts for the font family, and it will go with whichever one it finds first in the list. Okay, here's how I set up the entry dates. If you look in the image on the right, I know it's a little bit small there, but you can see the dates are on the far right, and they are alongside the actual blog entries. And how did I do that? I did that by using float. So I floated the entry dates to the right. I didn't have to set a width on this. I know in the caption example, I talked about how you should be careful to set widths on text when you're floating it. However, in this case, since the dates are actually years and they can never be more than 4 characters, that wasn't an issue. You are going to want to set a width on floating elements if they are text and if they are potentially long, because as you may recall from our discussion with the captions on the images, if you have a really long caption and you don't put a width on it, it will expand out to take as much of the web page as it can, including the entire web page if it's a long enough caption. You can limit that by putting a width on it. Here, I'm not limiting it again, just because I know that they're only 4 characters long. Okay, for each of the entries, you can see I have those red lines running across above and below each entry. How did I do that? Well, here I put a top border, which is 2 pixels solid red. And in addition, I put a little bit of extra padding and margin above each element. You'll notice that the padding and the margin actually lists 4 different values. What is up with that? Well, here's how that works. If you go ahead and set a single value, it is the padding or margin for all 4 directions. If you set 2 of them, you're setting a top and bottom, and then a left and a right. And if you set all 4, it starts in the top, goes to the right, goes to the bottom, goes to the left. So in this case, I could have said padding top and margin top, but I thought it'd be more interesting to switch things up so you could see this other technique. Now, one of the issues that comes up is this particular rule is putting a red line above each of the entries because I have the border top set to 2 pixels, but I'm not actually setting a bottom border. So how am I going to get the bottom border? There are several ways to do this. I think the most common technique is to add a class to the last item. And you can see here's the last entry here. I've added this class last onto it. And then I've written a rule that applies to just items that have class last. And so I've given the last item a border bottom of 2 pixels, solid red. And so all the entries have a top border and the last entry has a bottom border. And so that's how I get those 4 lines, the 3 on top and then the 4th line below all the elements. But there are other ways of doing this. So if you want to get fancy, we talked about this briefly. I mentioned this briefly when we were talking about pseudo classes, that there are these last pseudo classes. So there's a last child and a last of type. And so here's the last child. And so you can see all my entries actually fit in this div called main. And so if I write a rule that applies to the last child in main, that will apply to that bottom div. I could also write a last of type rule. And so here I'm saying I want this to apply to an entry, but I only want it to apply to the last of that type. So the last thing with an entry class, and you can see that I can go ahead and use that to put a bottom border on just the last of my entries. Okay, so originally I did not have a footer, but when I decided to turn this into a homework assignment for all of you, I wanted to have a little bit more interesting stuff for you guys to play around with, so I added a footer, but I wasn't really quite sure what to do with the footer, so I kind of cheated. So I thought I'd show you this little technique that I use to cheat, and that is you can actually make items disappear. There's two different techniques to make it disappear. This one is the display none. And so what this does is this just completely removes that element. So you can see here, I've got an entry footer here. If you look at the bottom of my HTML section here, you can see that there's a div class entry footer and that there's a bunch of entry tags for this particular item. And I decided I didn't want any of this to show up. By the way, you guys don't get to do this for your homework. Do something interesting with the footers and the tags. Okay, so by setting display to none, it just completely disappears as if it did not exist. The other way to make something invisible is to set visibility to hidden. This actually does something a little bit different than saying display none though. If you set the visibility to hidden, what happens is the space where that element would have been if it had been placed normally will still be there. The item just will not be shown on that space. So if we were to do this, you'd actually see some blank spaces for those entry footer divs down at the bottom of each of these entries. So you'd see a little bit of extra space where these circles are. I didn't actually do visibility hidden. So the image you see on the top right is actually with display none, just as the other images in this series have shown that. But you can play with these two settings, display none or visibility hidden. Okay, also, we did this with the caption example, but I thought I'd just mention it really briefly. I did surround the entire thing with a div. I gave it the ID all, and then I used the auto on the left and the right margin. That's how I went ahead and centered everything. Okay, so this idea of taking a bunch of elements and adding a class to it, that actually turns out to be pretty powerful. And so the idea here is HTML does not necessarily have tags for everything we think might be potentially interesting. And so if there isn't a tag available, a specific tag available, we can go ahead and sort of add one of our own by using a div or one of the other tags and actually giving it a class. And so there's a group that's really gone and run with this sort of idea, and that's the microformats organization. And so we're going to take a look at two microformats. The first one we're going to take a look at has to do with reviews. So suppose I was looking at, thinking about going to the movies. Sadly, can't do that right now. And I heard this Avengers Endgame movie was out, and I wanted to know, hey, is Avengers Endgame any good? And so I could go ahead and Google it. And if I Google Avengers Endgame review, you can see that some of the reviews actually have these stars in Google. So Google somehow knows that those are reviews and that they've given them a certain number of stars, and it's able to display those stars in the search results. How does it know that it's a review and that the reviewer gave a certain number of stars? Well, Google supports a microformat called hreview. And so here's the hreview, what the hreview format looks like. And this is an example from the microformats.org website. And if you look at this, you'll see that throughout the HTML here, there's a whole bunch of classes. I'm just going to focus on two of them up here at the top. There's a class hreview that Google can look at and say, oh, this does follow the hreview format. And then there's a class rating. And by Google looking for that class rating and seeing the number there, that's actually how it can determine how many stars to put in the summary. Another microformat that shows up fairly frequently is the vCard or hcard format. And this is for virtual business cards. And so the idea here is, people often have business cards that they can hand to people so people can get information like their contact information. And so the idea behind the hcard or vcard is that you can put that sort of information on your website, but it's not enough to just put the information on your website if you want people to be able to pull that information off and store it in a separate program. However, if you were to put that information on your website, notify people that you are using this specific technique, in this case, the vCard technique, tools that are designed to work with vCards can search through the HTML tags looking for specific entries with specific classes. So you can see here, I can see that there's a class street address. There's certainly no HTML tag for street address, but by putting class equals street address on it, I'm letting any tool that's designed to work with these vCards know that's my street address. It can go ahead and pull the information out of that tag, 169 University Avenue, and it can go ahead and stuff it into the virtual business card database. Similarly, there's a postal code, there's a telephone number, there's an email address. These are all things that don't have HTML tags associated with them. We will discover later there is an email for a form entry where people can type in email. But in general, things like the postal code, the country name, the telephone number, and presenting the email as opposed to entering the email into a form. These do not have HTML tags, but by putting classes on them, I am able to provide classification information that a program designed to read web pages can go ahead and pick that information out and go ahead and process it. So again, I just wanted to emphasize this idea that putting classes on elements can be used for quite a number of different purposes. All right, that's it for this example.